Okay, so welcome everybody. So wherever you're joining us from around the globe and whatever time zone you're on, myself and my fellow panelists here are just so pleased that you're able to be with us today and contribute to this conversation on pricing and cost transparency. So my name is Emma Wilson, and I'm the Director of Publishing at the Royal Society of Chemistry. And over the next hour or so, we'll be guided by our expert panelists, who I'll introduce in just a moment, as they highlight why price and cost transparency is so important and how it's a key principle in open research, not just in terms of how research is conducted, but also how it's disseminated. We'll hear the perspectives of funders, librarians and publishers who are calling for increased transparency and learn more about the models that they are championing and exploring. And of course, as we've heard throughout the last few days, the moment of sort of time that we're living through, the pandemic has pressed this conversation forward as well. Authors are racing to share their results as preprints, and we've had some terrific talks highlighting that. Publishers have rallied to organise peer review. So how can we take from this for the future? And is it time to unbundle the end-to-end publication process in terms of costs and pricing to better reflect value and need? So this is the last panel discussion that we have at OASPA 2020, and it will work in the same way as our other panel discussions and conversations have gone. We have four panelists who I'll introduce in just one moment, and I'll introduce everybody at the same time. They will provide their perspectives and overviews, and then we'll have time at the end for group discussion and questions. So please do post your questions and your comments using the Q&A feature on Zoom. We also have a chat feature which we're looking at as well. There's Twitter, which we're monitoring, and there's the Slack channel as well. So without further ado, I'll introduce our fantastic panelists, which I'm just so pleased have been able to spend some time and provide their knowledge and expertise this area. So starting the session and setting the scene from a librarian perspective is Kathleen Shearer, who's the Executive Director of COAR, which is the Confederation of Open Access Repositories based in Canada. And COAR's aim is to enhance the visibility and application of research outputs through a global network of open access repositories based on international collaboration and interoperability. Kathleen has been working in the area of open access and open science and scholarly comms and also research data management for over 20 years. She is a research associate of the Canadian Association of Research Libraries and was also instrumental in launching the Portage Initiative in Canada, which is a national research data management network. After Kathleen, we'll welcome Johan Rooryck, who is the Executive Director at Coalition S and a Professor of French Linguistics at Leiden University in the Netherlands. Johan is also the Editor-in-Chief of the FAIR Open Access journal Glossa, a journal of general linguistics, and is a founding member and president of the Open Access, the FAIR Open Access Alliance and the Linguistics in Open Access as well. And then we'll hear from the first of two publishers, Stephanie Paalvast, who is the Head of Open Research at Brill, also based in the Netherlands. She oversees the development and management of models and services that support open access and open science in the humanities and social sciences. She combines her experience with both commercial as well as not-for-profit publishing to move towards equitable and sustainable open access services suited to that unique landscape and diversity of humanities and social science research. And finally, we'll welcome Lucy Barnes, who is the editor and outreach coordinator of Open Books Publishers, a leading independent open access books publisher based in the UK. She does outreach work for the COPIM, which is the community-led open publications infrastructure for monographs project, and also for the scholar-led consortium. She's currently developing the Open Access Books Network in collaboration with Open, with Spark Europe and Operas, who we heard from yesterday. It was a great overview there. And she also has shared with us that she is, her words, slowly but surely completing a PhD on 19th century theatrical adaptations of novels and poetry. So, without further ado, I'd like to welcome Kathleen to provide her overview and thoughts. Thank you, Kathleen.
Oh, you're muted.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Are my slides in full?
Yes,
mode?
they are.
Yeah, okay, great. Yeah, no, it's just great to be here. And the talks this morning were so interesting. It was definitely worth it getting up early this morning to hear from our colleagues in China and India and across the world. As Emma said, I wear these two hats. I'm the executive director of COAR, and I'm also a research associate with the Canadian Association of Research Libraries. So I'm going to try to bring in both of these perspectives into my talk today. Okay, so we know there's a lot of money in the scholarly publishing system. According to Claudio Aspesi, who's a longtime analyst of scholarly publishing, the current academic journal market is valued at about 10 to 11 billion US dollars a year. So that's like a substantial amount of money. But in the subscription context for libraries, the pricing of scholarly journals is completely opaque, and especially so in the digital environment. And that lack of transparency has really been exacerbated as we have moved towards negotiating big deals, where publishers kind of bundle a huge number of journal titles into a big bundle and sell them to libraries through one big licensing agreement or library consortia. Yet we know how important transparency is. We talk about it, as Emma said, in terms of sharing research results, but it's also an important factor in building trust between kind of consumers and organizations, and making sure that they're accountable. When you look closely at the current market, it really makes you scratch your head, and it seems to be completely uneven and unfair. And there's really very little relationship between the prices of these big deals and the number of titles, the number of users, the size of institution, the gross domestic product, publishing costs, or any other indicator I can think of. And I'm just going to throw out a few figures here to highlight what I'm saying. This STM report, which is an overview of scientific and scholarly publishing, looked at the numbers from 2017. And so 41% of the revenues towards STM are coming from the United States, just 41%. 27% are coming from Europe and Middle East region, 26% are coming from Asia Pacific region, and 6% from all the other regions in the world. And this seems quite strange because, well, especially when you look at the population of these different regions, at Asia in particular, but the report goes on to explain that Many publishers were very keen to enter into the Chinese market several years ago, so they offered very low prices, in particular to China, and those prices have remained fairly low. The European University Association did a survey of big deals in Europe, and in 2018, and they found great disparities in the cost of big deals across Europe. They say it's worth noting that the relationship between big deals costs and gross domestic product per capita in their survey varied from 31 euros per person per year to 2,494 euros per person per year. So this is an incredible discrepancy. A report published by our Latin American colleagues very recently found that in Latin America, they looked at big deals from 11 countries, and in total, all those 11 countries together are spending $100 million US per year in their big deals, and that's comparable to what we're spending in Canada each year. So all of this leads me to believe that you know, the price being paid for these big deals is mainly based on how good or bad a negotiator you are. And, you know, this lack of correlation between price and costs, there's a danger that it's going to continue into the open access environment as more and more consortia are negotiating transformational agreements. So what we don't want to happen is that is replicated as we move towards open access. But this analysis undertaken by Ulrich Herb recently found he was comparing Switzerland and Germany and the big deals, the transformational agreements in those two countries. And he concludes by saying, it can be assumed that the fees paid are not based on the production costs of publications, but on the expected profits of the publishers and the willingness of the consortia to pay these fees. You know, not to mention that transformational agreements and pay-to-publishing models will definitely not work in some regions. This has been pointed out by many organizations over the years. And the concern is that if we go in that direction as the main scholarly publishing model, this will really exacerbate existing inequalities already in the scholarly communication system. So one thing we don't want to end up with as we move towards open access is a kind of two-tiered system where the rich countries are able to pay to publish in the prestige journals and everyone else is publishing elsewhere. So we really need to think about, as we move towards open access, how we can design a more inclusive and transparent system of scholarly communication. So, you know, each year libraries, or each 2 or 3 years when they renegotiate their license, the publishers come with more journal titles in their bundle, asking for increases in the licensing agreements, which essentially has a result of taking money away from smaller services, more localized services and infrastructures, and further marginalizing them. And so again, like I think as we're transitioning towards open access, libraries need to think about developing new funding models that do not rely on transactional interactions. So what other models can libraries develop to support non-transactional models such as pay to access or pay to publish? And this is key. I think this is key. It's very challenging, but it's critical that we do this. On the other hand, as I mentioned at the beginning, there's a lot of money in the scholarly publishing system. It's just how we're going to redirect that money. I did a survey last year with a colleague of mine from Carl Leesbreen, and we did a very in-depth survey of investments in open content services and infrastructure at the Carl libraries. And we found that right now, about 3%, a little over 3% of the full library budget is being devoted towards open content services and infrastructures, while about 40% goes towards subscription budgets. So if we think about the transition again, there's a lot of money there that could go towards supporting open services. It's just how we can direct that money to the services that are priority for us. So at COAR, we've been developing and promoting a new model that kind of decouples publishing functionalities. And this builds on our earlier work around next generation repositories. We call this model PubFair, and it's really a distributed model, very distributed model that would build overlay peer review and assessment services on a very distributed network of repositories, and at the same time develop dissemination services kind of like Spotify, where people, journals, associations could pick and choose the content that they want to include in their channel. And you know, these kind of overlay services are already being developed and already exist. I show you here a number of overlay journals. Actually, several overlay journals have been launched because of the COVID-19 pandemic. But the difference between what we're proposing at COAR and what these journals do is we're proposing to have those overlay services on a very distributed network of repositories rather than built in or baked into a single preprint repository. And this will allow those the system to be much more inclusive. And we also, the other issue is, you know, we really don't want to rely and be dependent on one centralized service. So with some colleagues, Herbert van de Sample and Martin Klein and Paul Walk, we have already developed a prototype for this decoupled model, and that prototype is available from the COAR website. We're inviting comments on the prototype right now, and we will soon be moving forward to pilot this architecture with a number of different organizations. And so just to conclude, I'd like to explain to you a little more why we think this model is a really interesting one and has a number of benefits that a lot of other models don't have. First of all, because it's inclusive and the content would be collectively managed by long-lived and trusted institutions around the world, mainly universities, you know, that have an interest in open sharing of research outputs. It allows us to balance local needs with global interoperability. I think it would be interesting for institutions and libraries to fund this because certainly the publishing functions, because it's actually adding value to their own local content that's in their repository. It allows us to start thinking about expanding peer review and assessment services beyond articles and monographs to other types of research outputs, such as research data. It will be completely open, and it will accelerate the impact and reuse of content because anyone will be able to build services on top of it, and it can scale across regions, domains, and content types. And so before I hand it over to Johan for his talk, I'd just like to conclude by saying we published today in the London School of Economics Impact blog, a blog post about the benefits that we've seen around open science and sharing of research outputs during the COVID-19 pandemic. And what we're calling for is to not go back to business as usual. So I hope that you can also amplify this message in your own local contexts. And with that, I'll turn it over to Johan and say thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. And Johan, the floor is yours.
Mute myself. So we just seg into the next, there's no discussion in between, I take it. Let's see how I can share this. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to speak from the funders' perspective, more specifically the Coalition S perspective about the price transparency frameworks that we have developed and why we have developed them and how they are going to work. So Principle 5 of the Plan S principle says that we support diversity of business models, but that publication fees, when they are applied, must be commensurate with publication services delivered, and the structure must be transparent to inform the market and with an eye to capping fees. Now, capping fees is no longer, not immediately on the table, but we do want transparency of prices to apply at every level, not just at the APC level, but as the implementation guidance says, we want to see the various services that go into publishing defined specifically, with, for instance, triaging, peer reviewed editorial work and copy editing. And this will apply to all prices that are being paid by funders, not just APCs, but on every level of payment for services to publishers. Now, the question that one might ask, and that's also been addressed by Kathleen, is the following: why price transparency? What is the problem? And the problem in our view, and the view of many, I believe, is that the prices for publishing services vary wildly and do not seem commensurate with the services performed. This is also something that was noted by Kathleen in the differences between prices that are being paid in various countries and by various universities and stakeholders. Price increases also are opaque, they're random, they seem random, at least to the customer, which is never a good thing in any business, I believe, and they're unsustainable for customers because we know that there is a lot of money going on around, but many libraries do no longer have the money to pay for these price increases. Prices, and this is something that's rankled me for a long time, the prices for academic services resemble those of luxury goods, namely the higher the journal, the higher a journal's prestige, the higher price is being paid. And somehow an academic journal does not strike me like a Louis Vuitton bag or a high-level Mercedes. And this lack of transparency, importantly, has led to a crisis of confidence between publishers and their customers, not only libraries, but also researchers, institutions, and funders. And I think this crisis is not a good thing for any of us. What the price and service transparency frameworks proposed by Coalition S is trying to do is to provide the customers with a better understanding of the various elements of publishing services, across publishers, across journals, and across disciplines. And this is basically also, again, addressing something that Kathleen talked about in her presentation. Why is this important? Well, it's important to build awareness among the customers about what publishers' services are and what their value is. I think publishers do not always, make it clear what their added value is. And I think a price transparency framework could play a role there. And it will allow also to rebuild confidence between publishers and their customers. It will also allow for, this will allow for price comparison for specific services across journals and publishers, and that will again inform libraries and customers to make decisions on the basis of price, as is customary in any other business. You want to be, when you compare two washing machines, for instance, you want to be able to compare them on the basis of their specifications in a service tool for that purpose. And basically, we want the same to be possible for academic journals. I don't mean to say there is no difference between an academic journal and a washing machine, by the way, but I think you get my drift. Finally, this will, we hope, promote competition in the scholarly publishing market. So that is why we want to promote this price transparency. So how do we go about this? Well, the background for this is the following. I mean, this Information Power developed a draft pricing and service framework in January 2020. That was being commented upon by Coalitionets and by various other instances. 10 publishers participated in a pilot to see whether this information was available at all, whether this was feasible. Of course, we were not going to develop a price transparency framework that was not feasible. And so this pilot helped validate the draft framework. So then we changed the draft framework as a function of that pilot. And we published that pricing framework. Parallel to that, the Fair Open Access Alliance, that I happen to be the president of, had been independently engaged in some discussions with publishers, NDPI, Frontiers, Brill, De Gruyter, and Copernicus, about price transparency since 2016. That was some sort of an informal gathering of publishers and open access activists to see whether we could not agree on some sort of price transparency, because of course this is a concern that's been going on for much longer. So this is a little bit of the background of this pricing transparency framework. And so what eventually emerged from this is that Coalition has approved 2 price breakdown frameworks, the one by the Fair Open Access Alliance on the one hand, which is a simpler framework in a way, if you like, and then the Plan S price and transparency framework that was developed by Information Power, piloted by these 10 publishers, and that requires much more detail. I'll come back to that in a minute. So we have approved these two frameworks for publishers to use to provide us with information about their publishing services. Now, the one developed by Information Power, as I said, is a little bit more detailed. It consists of a data collection spreadsheet, an implementation guide, and a set of recommendations to publishers. The data collection spreadsheet has 3 parts. It has it requires information for bibliographic journal metadata, and for data on list prices and waiver and discount policies. Then there is contextual metadata about acceptance rate, frequency of publication, and peer review times. That will inform the information that we get from them. And then part 3, there is price information about 8 categories of prices of services, so 8 price buckets, if you like, with of course the accompanying percentage. What is the percentage that these buckets take with respect to the overall price that is being asked per journal or per article, depending on what information we are seeking to get. The price transparency arrangement from Fair Open Access Alliance is practically identical, perhaps a little bit simpler, and I give you the example here, what it looks like. It basically says, look, we want separate prices for journal operations, for publication, for fees that you're paying, for communication, for general costs, and for surplus and discounts and waivers. Here also a number of publishers have done this. For instance, MDPI has done this, and some publishers have also told us, some publishers have implemented this, both the ones from Information Power and the ones who did the Fair Open Access Alliance breakdown, thought that this actually informed their own operations, that they discovered things about their own operations that they would have not been able to find or to realize before doing this. So this is clearly not just interesting for us as customers, it's actually also interesting for the publishers, even though a lot of publishers were kicking and screaming at the beginning that this is not how their operations run and that we didn't understand anything and so on and so forth. But it is an interesting exercise, and I think it will allow for more openness as we go along. what is important to know about the requirements of these two pricing frameworks is that Coalition S has decided that only publishers that give us this information about in the terms of the price transparency frameworks will be eligible to receive funds. So basically, we will only pay for an APC if that APC is transparently priced as of July 22. That is the idea. And this covers contributions to any model of financing. We make no difference whether this is APC based or whether this is contributions for Diamond or for transformative agreement or for transformative journals. Any money that is being paid for publishing will have to be transparent according to one of the two frameworks. The difference between the two frameworks, as I said, is the Fair Open Access Alliance framework allows for transparency at the publisher level and is actually implicitly intended for smaller publishers who do not have enormous resources to devote to this, who do not always have many journals either. That is sufficient. The one by Information Power is intended for the larger publishers who can devote more resources to this, who have dozens, if not hundreds of journals and who can provide more information. So we basically wanted to have these two levels for this reason, because we didn't want smaller publishers to be excluded because they would have to devote too many resources to this. But of course, in the longer run, we would like to have as much information about price transparency as possible. Let me be clear about that. So by December 21, we will provide details where this data can be deposited, and we will also indicate the conditions for accessing them. We have been warned about competition law requirements, I should say that, namely some publishers have informed us that other publishers should not be able to access the information of each other. So this is something that we will take into account. If we make a system for this, it will be in principle a system by authentication where publishers would not have access to each other's data in order not to fall foul of competition law. We will be building that system in the next few years. And of course, publishers who wish to include data from before that period would be definitely welcome to do so. Questions and discussions can come later because I believe it's time for the next presentation. If you have questions, feel free to ask me in the chat or later on. Thank you very much. I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Thank you, Johan. And Stephanie, the floor is yours. Our first publisher talk.
Yeah, thank you, Kathleen. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Johan, for your talk, and thank you all for being here. I'm really happy to be here as well and to share the publisher perspective. Yeah, so I can't promise you that by the end of this presentation you know the full truth about humanities and social science publishing, but I can certainly hope that that you will be a little bit more enlightened. And before I continue to, before I continue to dive into transparency and dive into our view on that and how we deal with that at Brill, I wanted to kind of start this with a question that really came up quite frequently when I was preparing this presentation, and that was really, what are we as publishers good for? What do we do? What value do we add? And thinking about all the recent debates and the conversations that are going on, really, to be honest, the best question that I could come up with is this, and that is that we are a big black box. Nobody knows who we really are. In the best case, we are just an anonymous black box, and in the worst case, this is the label that we receive. And of course, as a publisher, you will understand that I don't share that sentiment, because there is in fact a lot that we do. There are a lot of roles that we fulfill. The biggest one, and that's of course also one that I will be talking about more in this presentation, is that we are a service provider, develop services, to support academics, to support publishing. But besides that, we have also always been traditionally curators. And I think that's a function that's certainly not yet obsolete if you think about the way that online is moving, the way that big platforms are taking over the digital space. So I think that this is still a role that we can continue to fulfill. Of course, we are also partners for societies, for research centers to think about how do we present your output, how do you want to present that to the world, and sort of minor roles. But I thought that was also good to mention is that we can also really be counselors or even referees, and we have a very humane role sometimes. So when I talk about we, I talk about Brill, the publisher that I work for, that I represent. Brill was founded in 1683 in Leiden, and we continue to be based there. We are a social sciences and humanities publisher. We publish each year. We publish more than 330 journals, 1,100 books, and 20 major reference works. We employ about 180 people, and we are a publicly listed company at the Dutch stock market. And that means that our annual report is always publicly available online, so you can Google it and read it if you're interested. I encourage you all to do that. The biggest highlight, I think, from last year is that our total revenue was 30 million, and our profit margin the last few years has been between 6 to 8%. And of course, we also publish open access. Since 2013, we have been publishing open access. In the humanities and social sciences, we were really one of the early adopters to do so. And right now, annually, we publish between 40 and 50 open access books, around 600 open access articles, and we have 29 full open access journals with either a diamond model or an APC model. And of course, we work with the BPC and the APC model. Our BPC is 8,500 euros, and our APC is 1,950 euros. But we also do really try to support authors to find funding and to work with all kinds of models to make sure that open access is available to as many authors as possible. So that includes a number of transformative agreements that we made recently. We also use a crowdfunding model for a few journals, so it's crowdfunding by libraries. And we also, in addition, work with Knowledge Unlatched, and each year we publish a number of books in open access through the collaboration with them. Yeah, and what I wanted to do before I go into sort of our transparency experience, so to speak, is to kind of show you the impact that open access has already had on our business. And I think the biggest one is, and that continues today, is really that it transformed us, or it meant that we transitioned really towards service-based publishing. And that's not something that we didn't want to do, or you know, that was really strange, but it was something that we just were never required to do. And really with open access, that really changed. So for the first time, we were really sort of forced to identify kind of the value that we bring and the services that we offer. And to give you an example, for instance, that's of course become really clear, first of all, in our relationship with authors, because of course authors who publish in open access and who are paying a BPC from maybe their grant budget, for instance, they want to know what kind of services they get in return. So that meant that we really had to think about that, and that we had to start identifying these services and explain them to our authors explicitly, and not just sort of the editorial services, but also preservation, marketing, the uploading to various platforms for enhanced visibility, all sorts of all that kind of stuff. So that meant that there was really now a conversation on the transaction that is included in the relationship with the author. And this is also something that we now include in all of our open access contracts. So we really try to be very specific about, the services that we offer, which is of course something that we already did before in our contracts, but really not into that level of detail. So that's one example. The other, which is really very different, but I think also does show kind of the impact of open access on our business, is of course that there was a growing call from libraries, understandably, for us to showcase kind of the impact that open access has on the percentage of our content, how much of our content is open, and what do we do with that in regards to our pricing. So we developed a double dipping policy that you can read on our website. And that we execute each year to make sure that the prices are in proportion to the proportion of open access content. And I think the last thing that's really a change that has happened within Brill, but that has also been really quite profound and that continues today, is really that we kind of transitioned from a company that was making products and selling products to a company that was also a provider of services. And for instance, for sales, that was really a bit of a change, because all of a sudden they had to learn about these editorial processes and the relation and how we the workflows that we had with regards to publishing. And on the other hand, for our publishing department, it meant that all of a sudden they had to deal with this transaction that was happening in their author or editor relationship. So that's, I think, a really interesting transition that continues to take place, and it's really good for the business overall. It really means that we become more fluid, I think, overall, and less separated in different departments. But of course, this is all very nice, and it's all very nice that I'm telling you this and that we're doing this, but obviously it's not enough. I mean, I think the talk by Kathleen already kind of proved that there is still a lot of unclarity. We're just still stuck in this black box with a big ugly label on it. And that for us is really the main reason that we were really happy to be a part of the pilots that Johan just described. That we were really happy to participate in the Transparency Framework pilot. What I did is what I wanted to kind of start with is the results of the pilot, which you can see here. This is the breakdown for one of our journals. I think what you can see is, if you look at it, it's obvious that there are really three kind of big cost areas. The one is the journal and community development. So that's things like editorial fees, editorial meetings, conference support, but it's also overhead. So it's also the acquisitions editor that we employ to do this development, to develop this journal, to do the editorial meetings, prepare reports, etc. It's also editorial report, administrative report. And this is just an outtake of that list. There are really more things that should be there. And the other one is this one. So that's the triaging and also the peer review management. And that's really down to the fact that we are working with the manuscript submission system and its software. So there's always a price tag there. Of course, there are also submission costs for each individual manuscript. But also, for instance, overhead. This is also the data coordinator that we employ to manage this manuscript submission system, for instance, and to prepare reporting and to fix bugs and all those kind of issues. Yeah, and again, this is just these are just a few examples. And the last one is, I think, obvious to everyone. That's the production bits where we include typesetting and design and XML conversion, and well, the list goes on. As you can see, it's again overhead. It's again a production editor that we're employing to coordinate all these processes, and also a lot of other related overhead. So there are a lot of overhead. I think that's really key. And I have to say that it was really good to do this for a number of journals. I think we did it for 15 journals in total, but the picture wasn't really very different. I mean, there were some changes across journals, sometimes relating to editorial fees that are a bit higher or a bit lower, or there can be all sorts of reasons, but generally the picture was quite similar. And that kind of brings me to the experience of doing that pilot that I do want to share with you. Yeah, like I said, we were really grateful to be included, and it was also really a good. What I think is really nice about the transparency framework is that it's a good overview of all the services that we as publishers offer. And you know, I mean, I know that there are all sorts of lists out there. We all know, I think, the many lists that Scholarly Kitchen prepared, and publishers themselves have lists. And but this is really one big overview of really the core services, I think, that we offer. So that's a good thing, very useful. And the other is that this was also for us really the first time that we were really asked to quantify and evaluate our services on this level. So that was yeah, really interesting to do, an interesting exercise. But of course, there were also a few things that I think we felt were up for improvement. And I'm aware that Information Power and Coalition S have already also worked on that. I think our biggest takeaway was that it was really labor intensive to do it on the journal level. And that was primarily a concern for us because we felt that we really represented sort of the smaller publishers, also from the social sciences and humanities. And of course, it would be good if this is really meant to stimulate a competition, then it would be good that the framework is accessible and inclusive for all publishers and not just one of the big publishers that can afford to participate. So that was one point takeaway that we had. One other is that there is still a bit of room for interpretation. On the one hand, it's good that on the one hand, the buckets were really clear and also really extensive in terms of the services that were listed there, but it really does depend on the workflows that you have and the size of the publisher, sometimes where you allocate different costs. So I think that there might be some room there for a little bit more refinement or a little bit more standards to make sure that apples are being compared with apples. And what we really missed, but I mean that makes sense because it was a pilot, but what you would normally have when you develop a product is that you have a little bit of user or market feedback, and in this and here we kind of missed that a little bit, that it wasn't still clear how this is going to be used by libraries, for instance, or by researchers. But of course that I'm sure that is the next phase of development. So yeah, like I said, the takeaways that we can share for the next steps is that it's really important that there are clear standards. We would be really interested to hear input from users, so that's librarians, but also researchers, I think. That the framework is inclusive for publishers of all sizes, and that means that the input ideally is more on a portfolio level or subject level or something like that, rather than a title level. Those really were key takeaways. I know that Johan is not really hearing anything new right now. We already shared this feedback a number of times, and we also feel that has been listened to. So that is, that's really nice. And I guess it really will depend on sort of the next steps in the process to see how this is developed and implemented. And so what I wanted to close with, and I hope I'm not horribly running out of overtime, but I'll be quick. I wanted to close with the books because, to be honest, I mean, we, of course, so articles in journals, they are obviously a key part of our publishing program, but really for us as a humanities publisher, the other kind of key part for business is books, and especially now that we also see that there is a growing interest from both funders but also institutions in open access books. So we see that there's a growing interest there, and what we also encountered now a few times is that sort of individual institutions sometimes ask us for a breakdown of the BPC. And so that kind of led us to think about that, and to think about if we were to make something like the journal framework but different for books, what would that look like? And this is really what we came up with. I think we identified 6 kind of categories that the BPC is compiled of. I won't really go into much detail. You can all read them here. I think they do speak a little bit for themselves. It's editorial developments, editorial support and coordination. Production, of course, is really a big part for any book, for the cost of any book, and so for any BPC. Then also distribution, preservation, of course, a little bit for marketing and sales, and also a little bit for author services. And what I did not do is prepare a pie chart, and I did do that deliberately for 2 reasons. The one is that we have really only just started this idea of, how can we really communicate best how the BPC is made up? So, is a pie chart the best, or should we do that differently? And also, we haven't really, I admit, looked into the detail just yet. So if I made a pie chart now, I can kind of already, and I think anyone who knows a bit about book publishing knows where the big cost areas are, I think. But so we can all already visualize that. But the other reason is also that there are two variables in book publishing, and that's production costs and print sales. And that's of course the issue with open access books, is that in recouping the cost, print sales are still an important factor. And the other one is, of course, the production costs. And neither of those two is always predictable when you are publishing a book. Of course, we have ballpark figures, and we, of course, try to, on the one hand, try to keep the cost as low as possible, and on the other hand, really hope that the sales are the maximum of what we would expect them to be. But that's not always the case, and that's also not something that you can always predict upfront. So that is why, it's the BPC doesn't always cover the full cost of publishing. But nevertheless, I think we are really keen to really think about this a little bit more, and to discuss this a little bit more, and hopefully also with other publishers and with other parties as interest in open access books continues to grow. That was my talk. This is me. Feel free to reach out anytime, and I look forward to the Q&A session. And giving the floor back. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. That was really fascinating to learn more about your experience in using the framework that Johan had given us an overview of. And you've created, the whole session has created quite a lot of discussion in the chat, and we've also got questions flowing in as well. And obviously, Stephanie's part on books is a wonderful segue to Lucy's talk. So welcome, Lucy, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll just try and set these slides up. Okay. So thank you for inviting me to take part on this panel and to speak at OASPA.
Lucy, so sorry to interrupt. It looks like it's showing your Zoom window there. If you could just move the video column around, that should help.
Okay. Oh, let's try again.
Sorry about that. Thank you.
No worries. Is that better?
Yes, and we'll know for sure in full screen.
Okay.
It is still showing them grayed out. If you just put your mouse.
So that's deliberate. That's how I.
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, I'm so sorry. Continue.
No worries. That's fine. My design has created a stumbling block there. So my name is Lucy Barnes, and I'm an editor and outreach coordinator at Open Book Publishers, which is an open access scholar-led academic press. And I'm here today to talk about I suppose about our perspective as a smaller open access book press. So I'm talking about opening up the books and the value of transparency at OBP. I've sort of divided the talk into 3 parts. I'm going to talk a little bit about OBP, for those of you that may not know much about us or the work that we do. Then I'm going to talk about our business model and about why it works. And finally about transparency and transparency in its relationship to value in a couple of different ways. So Open Book Publishers is a leading independent open access book publisher. We've been going for 12 years. Today is actually our 12th anniversary. So we've not quite got the heritage of Brill, but you know, we hope we can make some contributions. And we were founded by academics, we're led by academics. And so we're very much kind of mission focused. The whole objective of what we do is to make knowledge available as widely as possible. And in doing that, we're a not-for-profit organisation. So our model is a break-even model. We have to make as much money as we spend in any year. At the moment, we're publishing between 24 to 30 books a year. And this year, we think it'll be sort of towards the top end of that, which is good news. And all those books are open access on publication. So there's no embargo period. They're all rigorously peer reviewed. This might be obvious, I don't know, but just to make that clear. It's a traditional peer review process, so we receive a proposal and evaluate it. An editorial board in-house evaluates it. And if we think it's sufficiently exciting and incredible, we'll send the full manuscript out to at least 2 experts in the field who will peer review it. Based on their reports, we'll decide whether or not we publish. And there's no charge for authors to publish, so we don't use a BPC model to publish our books. And obviously, I'll talk a bit more about that in the presentation. So just to make the point that we produce physical books as well as digital. Some people think that open access book publishing is only digital, but in our case and in many other cases, we produced physical books. This was actually a photograph in our office, which I took in February, I think, this year, not knowing that soon we would all be abandoning it. But those are all of our those are all examples of our books. We sell paperbacks and hardbacks, around £15 for a paperback and £30 for a hardback. So we try to keep those prices as low as we can. And we charge for 2 of our ebook editions as well, EPUB and Mobi editions at £5.99. But then, of course, you have the freely accessible editions, which, as I mentioned, are available on publication. So there's PDF, which you can read online or download. There's HTML, and most of our books are published in XML editions as well. And just to make the point that we're not sort of trying to do things at a kind of a basic level. We're not doing everything just on a shoestring. You know, we put a lot of effort and care into the books that we publish. And these are just a couple of examples of some of the more innovative titles that we've published. So the book on the top left, Annunciations, this was a project which was based at St Andrews University in Scotland. It was theologians and composers working together, thinking about this idea of the Annunciation in theology and in music. And as part of this book project, the composers created new choral pieces. And so the book includes chapters by theologians, chapters by the composers reflecting on the process. It includes the sheet music for the choral pieces, and it also includes recordings of those being performed, and they're embedded in the text. So as you're reading about the composer and their reflections, you can play the piece and hear it as you read. And then at the bottom there, Dickens's working notes for Dombey and Son. Obviously, Charles Dickens was a novelist, and in the process of composing his novels, he wrote lots of notes and meticulous worksheets. So this book analyses those worksheets for Dombey and Son and thinks about what we can learn from them about Dickens's writing process. So we have images of every sheet in the book, and we have a software which allows you to zoom in, so you can see the image of the full page. Some of the writing is quite crabbed, quite difficult to read, quite close together. So this is just a screenshot on the right that I've zoomed in on, so you can sort of see it at close range. What Dickens is writing and what's going on there on those pages. So they're just a couple of examples. We have embedded video in some books. We have embedded commentary and text analysis functions in others. We've developed some books, and in the process of a couple more projects where we take a database. So we have one out recently, the Lexicon of Nordic Law, which looks at medieval Nordic terminology for law, and it comes from a database of these terms. And the book is essentially a kind of printed record of that database, or book record of that database at a certain moment in time. And obviously, if it's in book form, it can be used differently than it can on the database, and it can be evaluated differently as well. But you still got that link with the live database, which is continually being updated. And of course, the reason why we do the whole thing is readership. So you can see here, this is a graph of 10 years of downloads and book visits. We haven't got the data in there from 2020, and I need to do some work on that, because obviously, in common with many open access book publishers and journal publishers, we've seen a great uptick this year in viewing statistics and downloads from people who are wanting to access material remotely. And so our books are currently being accessed really worldwide around 20,000 times each month. So that is obviously what we're kind of in it for, basically, to get those books out there to as many people as possible. And so having said all that, how do we afford to do these things? So this is our revenue model, and the statistics, the figures on the pie chart there, I'm not sure if you can see them, they're from our 2018 to 2019 figures, which I'll talk a little bit more about shortly. But just to give you an idea of the different chunks of that revenue model. So sales is that yellow chunk. I mentioned that we sell paperback, hardback, and some digital editions. And so that's the income from the sales of those. Grants and donations. So we don't charge authors to publish with us. We don't charge BPCs. We do ask if authors are able to get funding to defray the cost of publication, that they do that. This basically means that we can afford to publish more books by authors that don't have any such funding. And as I mentioned, publication, the decisions about publication are made on the basis of peer review. So if you have grant funding but your book doesn't pass peer review, then we're not going to publish it. If you don't have any funding but your book passes peer review, then we're going to take it on. And also we have grants and donations which come to us as a press, so that aren't attached to any particular book, that go into that chunk. Title production charges, so that's things like if an author has not produced an index for their book, then we will do that for them for a small charge. And then library membership is the final chunk, and that is our library membership program was begun in 2015, and basically libraries pay £300 for an annual membership, and that's to support our work, but also they get the free digital editions. So the digital editions that we'd normally charge for, the EPUB and the MOBI, the library gets those for free, and anybody on the library network can download them for free, and they can keep those ebooks as well. If the library membership ends, that they still get to keep those books, and they get discounts on the printed copies, and they also, the library receives metadata from us, and we support them in any way we can with things like Open Access Week and speaking at the institution about open access and things like that. So to talk a bit about the other side of the business model, about costs. So these are our standard publishing costs, and these are the costs as we lay them out in our handbook for authors. So this is partly so that authors can see, where the money's going, in terms of, the things that we put the most financial resources into are things that bear directly on the quality of the book. So you've got the proofreading and the typesetting. Apart from overheads, those are the two big kind of investments in terms of money. Obviously, that includes time and the various different tools that we use to do that job. And then you've got obviously things like cover design, website maintenance, distribution and retailing, marketing, all the obvious other things that you would want a press to be doing. And this is something that authors obviously can give. If they are applying for grant funding, they can give that to the funders and say, look, I need this amount of money, this is how the costs break down. But if we look at our actual costs for 2018 to 2019, you can see the costs on the left there and the revenue on the right. The revenue is slightly more than the costs, which is good news for us. And that excess there gets put back into the press so that we can publish more open access books. And if you break down the costs there to get to the first copy cost, so we published 25 books in that year. So if you look at the first copy costs, which is staff overheads and title production expenses, less printing costs and royalties because they're post first copy costs, then you get to 5,266 per title on average. So we've got these two figures for the costs of a book, but in some respects, neither of them is accurate, because of course the standard costs that we present, £5,000, and this average cost, no single book in that year may have cost that much, obviously. I talked earlier about our more innovative titles, so some of those titles are going to require more from us in terms of technical expertise, in terms of the tools that we use, in terms of the time that we spend on them. And likewise, if you get a book which requires more editorial time and care, more development from that point of view, you're going to be spending more on that book. Whereas if you have a book which comes to you, which is, very polished in the way that it's written, doesn't require as much editorial work, and which is, essentially a textual object that, it's not going to be improved by adding any of those supplements to it in terms of embedded digital material, or, a lot of images that are going to require a lot of time and care, then that book's going to cost us less to produce. So why does this business model work? I mean, I think its strengths are its flexibility. The revenue model is mixed, so it can be responsive to changing conditions. We're not reliant on any one strand to cover the whole of our costs. And that means that, say, for example, looking at the library membership program, say, for example, that were to shrink over the next couple of years, if libraries obviously are going to be facing strains on their budget, then we would be able to look at some of the other chunks and say, well, do we need to be publishing more books so that we can generate more income in sales? Or do we need to be thinking about applying for more grants as a press? And similarly, at the book level, there's no fixed cost for a book, as I've just discussed, but likewise, there's no fixed charge. And so this has two benefits for us. It means we can take on a variety of book projects. We don't have to limit ourselves just to the least expensive. We can take on more ambitious projects. But it also means that we can welcome books from authors who don't have the financial support to be able to cover a BPC. So that gives us much more variety in terms of what we can take on. And to some extent, this is true of any book publishing program. So if you're looking at a list of books, they're not all going to cost the same to produce necessarily. You might say, well, this is a niche book. Even if you're, say, a closed access press, you rely mainly or entirely on sales. Well, this book's a niche book. It's not necessarily going to sell as much, but this other book is going to be a strong performer on this list. It's going to make more than otherwise, a standard book might. So, I'm happy to have the lower performing book on the list. And similarly, if you're looking at a large press, you might say, well, my monograph arm really makes very little for me, but that's okay because I have a textbook arm, which is going to make a lot more. So the point that I'm trying to make is that each book does not pay for itself. It works as a system, and that's kind of the strength of it. And so book processing charges within that in some ways sit slightly oddly, because of course that sort of says that, well, this book publication process is something which we're going to approach as a single transaction. And it's certainly true that not all publishers cover all of their costs with a BPC. But I think that that's where, the transparency around BPCs, one of the things which would be good to know is, well, if you're charging a BPC, how much of the cost is that covering? What other revenue streams are you using, and how is that money being spent? And of course, we know the obvious problems with book processing charges. It transforms a barrier to read into a barrier to publish. So it's fantastic if we're saying these books are open access and people all over the world can read them. Particularly, people in lower middle income countries, perhaps, who may not have institutions or individuals who are as able to buy those materials. But if you're then saying, well, but of course, you can't necessarily afford to publish with us, then you're kind of on broadcast mode, and that's not necessarily where we want to be as a press. So the value of transparency for us, there's several different aspects to it. It builds trust, and I think this is actually something that's been mentioned several times during this panel. Sometimes open access presses, particularly newer open access presses, might be looked at with a certain amount of suspicion in some quarters. And I think by being open about our figures and our business model, we can say to people, well, look, this is where the money's going, this is where we're spending it. We're not making huge amounts of money from you out, sharing your research freely. And it enables a more meaningful relationship, particularly with authors and with librarians, because they can see, what we're prioritizing in terms of our costs, and they can see, where the money is going. So if you're a librarian and you're wanting to join our library membership scheme, you can see exactly what you're supporting. And similarly, if you're an author and you want to trust the press with your book, you can see the model that we adopt, and you can see the kind of the values that we have. And so I suppose that's another aspect of transparency and thinking about value. It demonstrates two aspects of that for us. It demonstrates our value for money, because I think we do a pretty good job for the costs that we take on. And it also demonstrates openness as a value. So it's not simply we publish open access books and people can read them and isn't that nice. We try to be as open as possible throughout all of our business and our approach to our work. Also, that openness allows us to be, in some respects, a model for other people. And in that, I'm not saying what the way we do it is the best way to do it, or that it's the only way to do it. It's absolutely not. But it is one way to do it, which is working. And so if you're a person who's thinking about maybe starting up a press, or if you already have a press and you're trying to think about, how are we going to make sure this business is sustainable, you can look at what we're doing in quite a lot of detail, and we're very open to discussing it with people and with presses, and think, well, what of this is going to work for me, and can I take any of it on, or would I change any of it? And lastly, the value of transparency, I think, is that it stimulates debate. Earlier this year, for example, I wrote quite a lengthy post about our business model, which has been taken up and used in discussions about, how are we going to, what are we spending our money on when we publish a book, and how much are we willing to support that in the future? Is it valuable? Is it useful? And I think, the previous presentation made clear, Stephanie was saying, it's something which internally a press does as well. They think, well, hang on a minute, if we're going to make these costs public, we better make sure that we're spending money on stuff that we believe in, that we think is important. So that is everything. I hope I didn't go on too long, and I'm looking forward to hearing about what the questions are and to having a conversation. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Lucy. That was a terrific sharing of the information that you have, which will be enormously beneficial, I think, in terms of providing ideas and seeding further conversations around business models in books publishing. So thank you to all of our panelists who provided the information. And now we have some questions. We have questions flowing in from the floor, so thank you. And also there is a huge amount of rich discussion on the chat. So please, if you haven't looked at that, please do. And there's links being shared and various other things there as well. So over to some of the questions. Johan and Stephanie and Kathleen, do you want to share your, share your videos if you're able to? Great. So a question that came in, I think really from Kathleen, but it actually pertains to a number of things as well, that Johan asked is, how can we ensure functioning market mechanisms with these new models? So I think that was the models that you were talking about, Kathleen, and real competition will be a prerequisite, and how to do that if the publish and perish model still prevails.
I must apologize because there's renovations going on upstairs. I hope you can hear me. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, yeah.
Okay, good.
And the renovation.
Bad timing. I think there just has to be regulation in this market. And that's what Plan S is doing. I mean, it may not be regulation in the same way we're used to, but we need to implement what we want from the library community, from the research community, from the funders, requirements on publishers, because publishers to me are service providers. They're not stakeholders, they're more service providers. And so we need to really implement some types of regulation around that, and transparency is part of that. And I think the other aspect of this is our incentive systems and this over-reliance we have on impact factor and H-index in our incentive systems and in our university ranking systems. And so we really need to move away from that. And I think that will provide a lot of relief for the market.
Thank you, Kathleen. Any of the other panelists like to share thoughts on that as well?
Yes, I totally agree with Kathleen. I think that the issue of competition is not so much one, I think, that one should play out on the level of researchers. I think it should be play out much more on the level of pricing. And I mean, because right now, I mean, one of the problems that we're having is that these prices are so so different, and since they are opaque, there is actually no real competition going on, except on the level of perceived prestige, which is a very odd thing if you think about it. Like I said before, you know, an academic journal is not a Vuitton bag. Really, a service is being performed, a piece of information is made available on the internet that has a price, and obviously, you know, if you have a kind of a profit margin like that of Brill, that's a reasonable profit margin. The company has to function. I mean, everybody understands that. But there should be among the service providers, there should be some healthy competition. I mean, it's not that we want to drive publishers in the ground or service providers in the ground. We need those services and we want to pay a fair price. But right now, the impression definitely exists that that price is not fair. It's not fair among libraries even in the same country. It's certainly not fair across the globe. Take, for instance, the APC. That's one of my sticking points. Take something like the APC. An APC at any publisher is the same worldwide, whether you are a Norwegian researcher or a researcher in New Delhi. Whereas if you compare that service to, let's say, a Coke bottle or even aspirin, a medication, both a Coke bottle and aspirin are going to be a very different price in those two countries. So APCs are inherently unfair. So these are things we have to think about. We have to think about new mechanisms that are more globally fair. And this is something that we will take up in future in coalition, in the context of coalition-S as well. I mean, we're all in this together, and by saying we're all in this together, I don't mean, I mean globally. You know, it's. I mean, we want the services of publishers, but we want them to be fair, in the sense that prices for medication are fair, or other prices are fair worldwide as a function of purchasing power and other factors. Anyway, on a tangent perhaps.
Thank you.
I see Kathleen nodding. I think we are in agreement. Yeah.
So there's a question here, which is, I think, really around, there was a lot of discussion about obviously the big deal and how that to some extent squeezes money out of the system, and how to get around that. And then there was quite a lot of discussion in the chat around read and publish and read agreements, and the pros and cons of various flavors of those. But as a question from Lisa, where there's a recent study of I presume Springer Nature contract that was published in College and Research, reported a surprising level of opt-outs or no author pay APCs. And the question is, how are you sort of monitoring that in your contexts? I think that would be to sort of Kathleen, and then also in the Plan S perspective, from the funders' perspective, how do how are you thinking about tracking fundee compliance?
Shall I answer that first? How we will
Go ahead.
track funder compliance? Yes, we will track fundee or grantee compliance. That is something that we are preparing now with the experts in Coalition-S. But in principle, the grant conditions, in principle, each Coalition-S funder will have their own compliance principles. So they will enact their local mechanisms for checking compliance with the contract. In certain contexts, for instance, I know in the Netherlands, for instance, I know that can mean that if you don't comply, part of your grant will be withheld at the end. That's one possibility. For other funders, there may be sanctions of a different kind. I mean, we do not want to have one single policy, one size fits all punitive mechanism, but there will be sanctions, yes.
Yeah, we have, in Canada, I'll use Canada as an example, we have actually no clue how many APCs are being paid by Canadian researchers. We know in our study that we did at Carl, the survey, we know that very few APCs are being paid through the libraries. But there are, you know, we see that many researchers are publishing open access through this mechanism. So we've just started a working group of the library consortia, Carl and the funders, and bringing in the institutions, the universities as well, to try to be more organized in terms of tracking the APCs in Canada, because I think it's a really big gap in our knowledge right now. And you know, it would be great if the publishers would provide us with that information. I'm not the person who negotiates directly with the publishers, but I think our consortia are having trouble getting that information from publishers.
Yes, I see that Lisa has added in the chat that it's not about the punishing, but about the tracking. I can answer that as well. This is actually something that we are discussing among Coalition as experts. So how do you track? Now, usually, of course, what happens with funders is that grantees have to bring in, have to hand in reports. They have to report on their publishing. Usually, also these articles, I mean, if they're in gold open access, they're being paid. So there are tracking mechanisms to see if these publications are in open access. So and this is indeed something where we are sharing information and experiences across funders. It's actually one of the great things about Coalition S. You know, you can share best practices on how to best address this question in terms of collecting that information and making sure that your policies are being enforced once you have the relevant information.
Thank you. And Stephanie, there's a question from you for you, and you touched on this, I think, in the presentation. But it says, you know, in your participation in the Transparency Framework pilot, did it lead you to rethink Brill's investment in services? So, as transitioning to a more service-orientated organisation, the split down in costs suggested that some of the customer service parts were much smaller than other aspects.
Yeah, I'm aware, and I think that's really a little bit down to the how do you say that, to how the framework is set up, because of course the cost that we have, the true cost that we have for author support, that's, I think, at least 60% of what we do with the journal. I mean, that's also really the whole part that comes before publication. And this is really, I think this particular category was really about, you know, after publication, when an author has queries about licensing or stuff like that, then we do have separate contacts for that. But of course, the majority of the author support is happening with our editorial department, and that's a big cost item, I think, as we've seen. And also, I mean, customer support, that's also really part, and I think maybe that's also what I meant with that there is a little bit of room still for interpretation, because for us, customer support is really embedded within sales, so that's also partly within the sort of the marketing and sales bucket. So yeah, it's almost semantics, I guess.
Yeah. No, I that sort of resonates very strongly, actually, because that would be our own experience. We didn't participate directly in the trials, the pilot, but you know, effectively our whole editorial department is set up around author services in some way, and so it would represent a big part of our cost base as well.
Yeah. But Emma, I think this is actually a very interesting discussion among publishers. I think there should be more of that. I mean, you know, because publishers could learn from each other's experience in making these price transparency exercises together. Because that, I mean, that's not a matter of competition. It's just saying how are you approaching this, and how are you solving this particular problem? Because you know, you guys all share the same kinds of problems, because this has never been thought of before. So it could be really fun to have a sort of discussion among publishers about this.
I'm sure there will be many. And this is a great question. I think that kind of builds on some of the complexity around particularly potentially for mixed model publishers as well. But Stephanie, there's a question that says, how do you establish the cost base for your open access journals when you're using the infrastructure from your subscription publications?
Yeah, I mean, like that's really the only answer that I can give, and it's a brutally honest answer maybe. But of course, we also for our open access journals we make use of the same infrastructure. Yeah, they have the same costs, but of course, and yeah, and that's true. I mean, that's in that sense, they're really heavily cost based, but then that calculation is also based really very much still, and that's the case actually for all our journals, on the old page budgets, which some publishers may recognize. We used to really charge by the page, and or not charge but calculate by the page, and yeah, we continue to do that because it's easy. I think that, and yeah, that's really the only answer that I can give there.
Thank you. Now I'm going to combine quite a few sort of comments and questions that have come up. It's quite be very interesting to get your thoughts, but it's around what is the appropriate level. You know, we talked a lot about cost and then price transparency, but what are your feelings, you know, for each of the panelists as what is the appropriate sort of profit or surplus to make publishers sustainable? And there's some specific comments around society publishers and small self-publishing society publishers, where, you know, who are aiming to provide and deliver the best services to their authors, often operating on very low costs as well. So I'd be very interested, I'm sure the entire audience would be as well, to get your thoughts on what the appropriate levels of or fair surplus that allows publishers to invest in new publishing incentives and support their communities as well.
Well, there are, I mean, if you look across various industries, it's very interesting to compare industries. I mean, if you look, for instance, at retail, or let's say, you know, food, you know, big supermarkets, they operate on razor thin margins. On the other hand, there's, you know, Apple, Google, and so on, right? That's not exactly, the truth should probably be somewhere in between. I see Brill, right? I mean, if you look at, you know, they have operated for 400 years. They seem to be able to make a decent living with 6 to 8%. I hear the same from various other smaller publishers, 6 to 8%, and that is something that they can live with and reinvest with and operate on. I mean, if you look at the car industry, it's like, you know, something between 12 and 15%. Of course, these things are not comparable, but if I see various smaller publishers making a living and being able to pay their staff a decent wage, I mean, I hope, Stephanie, I'm saying this right, but, you know, then 6 to 8% is I think a reasonable amount. But I mean, who am I to talk? You know, I'm not in the industry, but I can only compare what I see publishers telling me, and this is one of the great things about the price transparency exercise. I mean, I think nobody will deny that, you know, 6 to 8% is a reasonable thing. And everybody will agree that 30 to 40%, especially when that 30 or 40% profits are made of mostly made of public money, that is a bit obscene, actually. So.
Yeah, and just to follow up on what Johan's saying, I think the real issue is that because the profits are so high, it's created a very unhealthy system. That and so I mean, I kind of agree with you, Johan. Small amounts of profit are perfectly reasonable, but this huge 40% profit that the commercial publishers are making are just
big commercial.
You know, it's too much, and what's happened is it's incentivized them to buy up all of the small publishers. It's killing bibliodiversity. They're buying up all the small publishers. Then all of the journals are, you know, move away from other languages into the English language. They're pushing the value of metrics on all of us, and so it's just had a very negative impact on the whole scholarly communication system in general.
Yes, it is basically killing the ecosystem, the diversity of the ecosystem.
Right.
What in France has been called bibliodiversity, right? La bibliodiversité.
Exactly.
And I think that's exactly right. That is, we don't want that. If anything, we want to go against that. That's why I think, I mean, I've been reminded of this by Finnish colleagues that we should really make a difference between, let's say, the big publishers who are making these profits that we don't endorse, and the smaller publishers who are really doing an important service to the field, you know, publishers like Brill here at the table, and others who do this work in niche areas that nobody else is doing, and who are making a decent living and you know, give us an excellent product in exchange.
Yeah, I mean, that's why in our paper about bibliodiversity, we recommend that, you know, each country look at their local journals and try to put aside some funding towards those local journals, because they're playing a very important role.
The Finns have done that, and the Dutch have done that. The problem really is the smaller countries that are not as, let's say, financially well off. For instance, I know that in Croatia, this is a big problem, and in other countries that have, you know, local languages, this is a big problem, because it's really difficult to find the money for maintaining those smaller publishers and having them contribute to a healthy and diverse, bibliodiverse ecosystem.
Yeah, if I could just interrupt there. I mean, I do, as you may understand, maybe I do find this a bit of a challenging question, because I'm not convinced that it's a particularly helpful question. We can all agree that a certain profit margin is inappropriate, but then who will be the body to really enforce that or to change that? And the other thing is that from our experience,
nobody wants to enforce it, Stephanie. We don't want to enforce anything. We just want there to be a healthy competition, be reestablished, that people can, you know, offer the best service for a reasonable price. But there is no body that intervenes here.
No, I'm aware, and I think that kind of touches on the next aspect that I wanted to mention, is that from our experience, really, if we look at where the money is going to from consortia, so really the kind of the bigger parties, then that is the big five publishers, and we would really like that there was a little bit more attention, so to speak, also for us. But the reality is that this is not happening. I mean, there is enough money in the system, and we fully agree, but we don't see it really. We in the spending, we don't really see competition being encouraged. Rather, we can see a reinforcement of the current monopoly. So yeah, I think that there's also an area there that maybe needs a little bit more attention.
I think as well, just to add in very quickly, there's the aspect which I think has been mentioned in the comments that, you know, the kind of academic prestige economy drives a lot of authors' decisions about where to publish, which in turn is then going to drive purchasing decisions. So, you know, there's a certain extent to which this is not really in publishers' control, in the sense that, you know, if there's a publisher which is making profit margins that many people deem unacceptable, but people keep publishing with them, what are any of us supposed to do? Like that's you know, a point worth making, I think.
Thank you, Lucy.
Yeah, well, that's why we're trying to change the incentives and reward system, right? I mean, that's why we have to print Principle 10 in Coalition S. That's what and the funders are really committed to that, in the sense that, you know, grants are now being selected on the basis of DORA and Hong Kong principles, not on the basis of quantitative metrics. That is going to require, of course, a big cultural change. It's going to take 10 years to implement that. I'm afraid to wean people away from the fact that they have to publish 12 articles a year or they don't exist. So that is going to require a deep cultural change. And once that changes, then of course the prestige of the journals, the so-called prestige of the journals will diminish as well. And we will hopefully go back to a system that is where the quality of the individual article matters more than the fact that it is published in Nature or Science. Right?
It's as you said, it's an ecosystem, isn't it? And the research culture is also playing. You know, it's difficult to isolate certain parts because it's a complex.
And that's exactly why Coalition has chosen for the systemic approach, right, where various policies complement each other. I mean, you can't. There's no single magic bullet that will solve this. You really have to look at all the moving parts and change all of those moving parts at the same time in the right direction. And again, I mean, we're all in this together. We can all turn the buttons in our respective areas if we want to.
So I think interesting this morning hearing about the Chinese policy, because that policy is a sea change for China in terms of taking away the emphasis of publishing in prestige journals or high impact factor journals. And so that change may come more quickly.
Yes, I think that is fantastic. I mean, you know, and that will have a huge impact. I mean, also around the world, I think. I mean, I think.
So I'm afraid in the interest of time, I'm going to have to draw this to a close. So all it remains for me to do is to thank our panelists for a really fascinating discussion and insights this afternoon. Well, this afternoon for many of us, not all of us, Kathleen, of course, and of course, thank our audience for joining us. And we're just so pleased that you were able to be here at OASPA 2020. There is a short break now, but there's fantastic poster session and the poster lightning talks in half an hour. So I do hope everyone is able to stay with us. And I would just like to thank our sponsors as well, who were brilliant and made a lot of this happen. And behind the scenes, there is Claire and there is Bernie and there is Chloe, who are doing an amazing job. So thank you all. And it's really, really been my pleasure to be part of this. Thanks again.
Thank you, Emma.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye,
Thank you, Emma. Thank you, everyone.